Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. If you've listened to many of my previous episodes, then you might know there's one thing I rarely like covering on this podcast, which is whatever you suggest. I really enjoy getting messages from people from all over the world asking me to cover particular topics, and one thing that does come up again and again and again is the British Empire. This fascinates me because in my day-to-day life in the UK, I would say the British Empire very rarely gets talked about. I wouldn't say it's particularly featured in our films, our television shows, our popular media. I don't think it's something that's particularly thought about, and it's certainly not very much in our education system. Now, of course, some people might instantly say, films? Of course it's covered in films. What about Lawrence of Arabia? In which case, I'd say, there's my point. There's a classic 1960s film made long before I was born, and it's probably still the greatest film on the British Empire, unless, of course, you prefer The Man Who Would Be King, which I slightly do, and it's slightly more recent. But this great film, with Michael Caine and Sean Connery, stars Michael Caine and Sean Connery when they're young. It's a very, very old film. There hasn't been anything, well, really in my lifetime at the same level. Equally, I don't think most British people's favourite books are books that touch on the theme of empire, and I think most of my schooling really avoided the topic altogether, which does seem extraordinary. I mean, I remember being taught about Romans, I remember being taught about Greeks, I remember being taught about ancient Egyptians, but I don't particularly remember being taught about the British Empire, perhaps about the Industrial Revolution, and perhaps it being touched upon very briefly with the World Wars, but even then it was mostly the Blitz, it was the home front that was stressed, and that seems very, very unusual. If I go to that well-known reliable source, Wikipedia, then I find there is a page on it, it does exist. I wanted a quick go-to definition, what was the British Empire, and sure enough, at the top of the page it has it. Wikipedia says the British Empire comprised the dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates and other territories ruled or administered by the United Kingdom and its predecessor states. It began with the overseas possessions and trading posts established by England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. At its height in the 19th and early 20th century, it was the largest empire in history, and for a century was the foremost global power. By 1913, the British Empire held sway over 412 million people, 23% of the world population at the time, and by 1920, it covered 35.5 million kilometres squared, 24% of the Earth's total land area. As a result, its constitutional, legal, linguistic and cultural legacy is widespread. At the peak of its power, it was described as the empire on which the sun never sets, as the sun was always shining on at least one of its territories. Well, certainly seems significant enough. Yet, as I say, I remember being taught a great deal about the Romans, which seems really interesting. There's a question going around, I think late last year, asking, how often does your man think about the Roman Empire? I'd say I definitely think about it at least once, maybe twice a day. It is a significant part of our history. In the West, perhaps especially, because education for a long time was the preserve of churches. And of course, a bit of Roman history is very much needed for reading, well, the New Testament. And of course, you study about Greek history. Educated Romans wrote in Greek. And then, of course, Egyptian history, well, good parts of the Old Testament are very difficult to understand without some understanding of Egyptian history, and of course all three relate to each other. So I remember being taught about this, but the British Empire, not so much. In fact, I think today a young person could go through the whole of primary school, secondary school, and even university studying history, specialising in history, and the amount of time they devoted to the British Empire would be very, very little. I do, however, have a bit of an interest, and part of the reason is because when I was 16, I went to live in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. This is an independent state, but an unrecognised state, Cyprus, however, as an island, was once part of the British Empire, and that, of course, was still in living memory when I went to gain independence in 1963, well known to me because I lived there. And of course it's obvious to me. As I went around, I could see the post office built by the British, or I could see the fact that the harbour, a certain section, had been improved by the British at the time. Not, of course, the whole thing created. The previous empire, the Turks, had created a significant part, and of course the Venetians, when they ruled Cyprus, had constructed a significant part, and just round the corner from the harbour that was functioning at the time of the British, you could see the Roman harbour they had created, and further along the coast, the one that the modern government had created. We very much had the idea of a succession of states going right back to the ancient Greek times. It was very obvious. The British Empire was one of 20, 30 different empires, and as the most recent, and as I am British, it naturally became interesting to me to start looking into it. And of course I couldn't escape it with my own family history. Father born in Malaya, now Malaysia. My aunt was born in Cyprus, and my grandfather was born in British India. And in fact, my family have been out there for generations. Recently, I've been going through photographs that my grandmother has, and they have been, passed down. So I've got pictures of my great-grandmother riding a motorbike in old British India, my great-grandfather wearing a pith helmet, smoking a pipe as he holds my grandfather as a baby. Some great pictures, and photographs of the last train station before a member of the family headed up the Khyber Pass into, along up into Afghanistan if you go far enough. So, with bits of family history and bits of my own history, of course I lived in Shenzhen, China for 6 years, and from Shenzhen, China, mainland China, you can see Hong Kong. You can see the difference between somewhere that has always been Chinese and somewhere that was part of the British Empire. In fact, you can also take a ferry to Macau and see a part that was once under the Portuguese. So, my own life experience has taken me out to these places. It's made me curious, and my education in terms of schooling didn't really cover the British Empire, maybe briefly, touching on the slave trade, perhaps, maybe a bit on India, but not a huge amount. So, right next to me, next to the microphone, I have, I'd say, my 5 favourite books. I wouldn't say I've read a huge number of books, but then again, the fact that I had a top 5 suggests that maybe I've read more than I thought I have. And it's perhaps natural that when you're choosing your favourites, and I'll start with my favourite and work my way through, my favourite book on the British Empire just also happens to be the first one that I got. And I know that's a very, very common thing for Bond fans, the favourite Bond film is normally the first one they saw in the cinema, and their favourite Bond is the one that was current when they were young. For Star Wars fans, it's kind of much the same. For anything, really. People supporting football teams, it's often, the one that was really big when they were young, and for music, goodness me. Almost invariably, people seem to discover bands in their teens, and that's it for the rest of their life. So for me, I discovered this book in my teens, and I think it's fantastic. It's simply called The Rise and Fall of the British Empire by Lawrence James. It was first published, let's have a look at the front page. It was first published in 1994, but it has been revised and revised, and has been reprinted. I'm not saying it's a quick book to read, taking into account the appendices. It's about 700 pages, maybe a bit of a door-stopper. However, the way it's written, chapter by chapter and section by subsection, it's actually a surprisingly good commuter book. If you take the train to work and have half an hour to kill on a book, I think this one actually works really, really well. It's very dip in, dip out-able. And, maybe I'll just read the introduction. Lawrence James writes, "Sometime in the early 1980s, I undertook a brief tour of what had once been the commercial powerhouse of the British Empire. By then, that complex of wharfs and solid brick warehouses which stood along the north shore of the Thames was derelict. Nonetheless, the overall effect was impressive, and the cast iron street signs, Jamaica Street, Ceylon Street, advertised the sources of past prosperity. The abandoned docks of London and Liverpool and Bristol are among the grander monuments to Britain's moment of empire and world power. There are others. The shells of Lancashire cotton mills which spun yarns for India. The shipyards of the Clyde and the Tyne which built steamers to carry Britain's trade, and the men-o'-war which protected it. And the country houses of the merchants and nabobs turned country squires who raked in the profits. One of the latter, Sir Charles Cockerell, having made a fortune in India at the end of the 18th century, had his mansion built in a style which combines the novelties of the Prince Regent's Brighton Pavilion with Indian motifs, including a dome of the sort which would have been set over a mosque. The Cotswold landscape around the house is enhanced with ornamental gardens, with an Indian shrine and a bridge decorated with Brahmin bulls. Bringing India to Gloucestershire was a nice reminder that the imperialism was a two-way process. Human memorials of empire are abundant. David Livingstone, one hand resting on his revolver, and the other clasping the Bible, overlooks Princes Street in Edinburgh. Walk up towards the castle, and one is confronted by an embattled and, thanks to weathering, gaunt stone Highlanders who form their country's monument to the Boer War. Churches and cathedrals are draped with dusty, threadbare regimental ensigns embroidered with exotic names such as Chilianwala and Tel El Kabir, and the men who died in these and other battles often commemorated nearby in marble and brass. Pub signs celebrate imperial heroes, and street names, conquests and conquerors. In the northern suburbs of Southampton, I once saw Khartoum Road and Omdurman Road, and in the small West Riding town of Crosshills, a Rhodesia Road. All, to judge by the houses built along them, date from the beginning of the century. The physical impact of the empire on Britain is easy to see, the mental less obvious. Readers may detect in my chapters on the empire and the people the origins of codes of behaviour and outlook which still hold some sway, though less so 30 or 40 years ago when the empire was still in existence. I've tried to show that possession of an empire profoundly influenced the ways in which the British thought of themselves and the rest of the world. The British character was changed by the empire, and this is important. It encouraged a sense of superiority, which is also a feature of another former imperial power, France, that frequently bordered on downright xenophobia. It also fostered racial arrogance, and yet at the same time, deeply rooted liberal and evangelical ideas produced a powerful sense of imperial duty and mission. The empire existed to civilize and uplift its subjects, or so its champions claimed. They had to, for the British were never entirely at ease with the idea of a territorial empire. From the 17th century, and with considerable official encouragement, the British were taught to be proud of their laws, individual freedoms, and elected government. But many asked, were the rights of the British exclusive, or could they be exported and shared by everyone under British rule? This question dogged the empire throughout its history. Well, so begins the rise and fall of the British Empire, a book that I read when I was a teenager, living in the former British Crown colony of Cyprus. And one thing I particularly liked about this book is the fact that it focuses on facts. This book, if it is to be criticised for absolutely anything, is probably to be criticised for the fact that there's very little analysis, except perhaps in the introduction, and a very interesting analysis at the conclusion. But for the most part, it simply lays out the facts. dates, peoples, events. They're all laid out very, very, very methodically. So that's why it's still my go-to book on the British Empire. And if the title is familiar to you, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, I have actually read out sections from this book before when dealing with aspects of British imperial history. So that's my favourite, and rather than count down from number 5 and go onwards, I thought I'd just go through my favourite and now my second favourite. My second favourite is almost the opposite. It's very, very analytical. It talks about rights and wrongs of empires to a great extent. The book is called Empire: How Britain Made the Modern World, and it's by the historian Niall Ferguson. He's most famous for his book The Ascent of Money, and he's done some great documentaries on PBS, and I believe there was a PBS documentary on Empire, so if you prefer a television documentary, this was great. This was written around 20 years ago, and one thing that really grabbed me is in the introduction, he gives his personal history of the empire. He gives his personal journey, which is not entirely unlike my own personal interest. He says, thanks to the British Empire, I'm reading from the introduction, thanks to the British Empire, I have relatives scattered all over the world, in Alberta, Ontario, Philadelphia, and Perth, Australia. Because of the empire, my paternal grandfather John spent his early 20s selling hardware and hooch to Indians in Ecuador, not a colony of course, but part of Britain's informal economic empire. I grew up marvelling at the 2 large oil paintings he brought back of the Andean landscape which hung luminously on my grandmother's living room wall, and the 2 Indian dolls, grim-faced and weighted down with firewood, incongruous besides the china figurines in her display cabinet. Thanks to the empire, my other grandfather, Tom Hamilton, spent more than 3 years as an RAF officer fighting the Japanese in India and Burma. His letters home, lovingly preserved by my grandmother, are a wonderfully observant and eloquent account of the Raj in wartime, shot through that sceptical liberalism which was the core of his philosophy. I can still recall the joy of leafing through the photographs he took while stationed in India, and the thrill of hearing his stories about swooping kites and sweltering heat. Thanks to the empire, my uncle Ian Ferguson's first job after he qualified as an architect was with the Calcutta firm of Mackintosh Burn, a subsidiary of the Glanders Managing Agency. Ian had started his working life in the Royal Navy. He spent the rest of his life abroad, first in Africa, then in the Gulf States. To me, he seemed the very essence of the expatriate adventurer, sun-darkened, hard-drinking, and fiercely cynical. The only adult who always, from my earliest childhood, addressed me as a fellow adult, profanities, black humour, and all. His brother, my father, also had his moment of wanderlust in 1966. Having completed his medical studies in Glasgow, he defied the advice of friends and relatives by taking his wife and 2 infant children to Kenya, where he worked for 2 years, teaching and practicing medicine in Nairobi. Thus, thanks to the British Empire, my earliest childhood memories are of colonial Africa. For although Kenya had been independent for 3 years and the radio constantly played Jomo Kenyatta's signature tune, Harambe Harambe, Let's Pull Together, scarcely anything had changed since the days of white mischief. We had our bungalow, our maid, our smattering of Swahili, and our sense of unshakable security. It was a magical time which indelibly impressed on my consciousness the sight of the hunting cheetah, the sound of Kikuyu women singing, and the smell of the first rains and the taste of ripe mango. I suspect my mother was never happier. And although we finally came back to the grey skies and winter slush of Glasgow, our house was always filled with Kenyan memorabilia. There was the antelope skin on the sofa, the Maasai warrior's portrait on the wall, the crudely carved but exquisitely decorated footstool that my sister and I liked to perch on. Each of us had a zebra skin drum, a gaudy basket from Mombasa, a wildebeest hair fly whisk, a Kikuyu doll. We did not know it, but we grew up in a little post-colonial museum. I still have the carved wooden hippopotamuses, warthog, elephant and lion, which were once my most treasured possessions. Niall Ferguson talks about this colourful, to me, childhood, and then talks about the shock of going to university and discovering how unfashionable so many of his ideas were. In fact, he even touches on his teens when the idea of a world ruled by chaps with red coats, stiff upper lips and pith helmets had become something of a joke. But here in Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, he sets out the good that the Empire did and the bad that he feels it did. It is very much an analysis with chapters like White Plague, Heaven's Breed and Maxim Force. I feel that gives a taste of the book, and it's quite a contrast to the Lawrence James Simply Tell the Facts. It's a more personal account and a much more analytical account. One that I enjoy very, very much, although it is, I would say, my second favourite. So having talked about my favourite and my second favourite, it seems the natural order of things that I should turn to my third favourite. This again has a very different take. It is the James Morris, or Jan Morris if you get a later edition, Pax Britannica, the climax of an empire. This is part of a trilogy of books which looks at the British Empire not so much through the facts of who conquered who and when, and not so much through the analysis of was it a good or a bad thing. Rather, it looks at the British Empire through an artist's eye. How was the empire perceived and portrayed? What were the theatre plays, the art, the music, the poems? I find this a really unusual take, and I've never come across anything quite like it. As I say, it's part of a trilogy, Farewell the Trumpets and Heaven's Command. Pax Britannica is, of course, about the empire at its climax, and I find that particularly interesting. I think it's Farewell the Trumpets that covers, among other things, Lawrence of Arabia. But I find it really, really interesting. As I say, it's really all about how the empire was portrayed and perceived, something that would never have occurred to me to even cover. But this is a book that my grandparents had, and I ended up being loaned it as a permanent thing. Here's something from the chapter Challenges and Responses. Into the mystique of every British settlement, some particular old adventure had by now been absorbed and had become familiar to every school child. This, of course, is in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. They mostly seem to have been heroic defeats, and this perhaps reflected the classical education of so many imperialists, conveying the British spirit to Thermopylae, or to the bridgehead with Horatio, or perhaps in the eternal struggle, brave failure was somehow more salutary than success. In Australia, the origins of the colonies were, owing to a shortage of anything more inspiring, most famously commemorated in a dreadful picture of the discovery by two explorers, Burke and Wills, that a food cache they expected to find in the middle of the outback was in fact empty, condemning them to another 8 months of heroic nightmare. In Canada, the picture on the schoolroom wall showed the death of Wolfe at Quebec, fragile and selfless upon the plains of Abraham, with the army of his gallant enemy silent in the background. In Rhodesia, the classic scene was Alan Wilson's last stand against the Metabale. There was no survivor. In Natal, the 80 men of Rorke's Drift held out forever against their 4,000 attackers, immortalised in scarlet and gunsmoke by the brush of Lady Butler. And in England, the spirit of empire was perhaps most popularly symbolised by the vision of General Gordon, that Galahad or Gabriel of the later Victorians, standing guileless, unarmed, fresh-faced, almost radiant, at the head of the stairs in his palace at Khartoum, whilst the ferocious Mahdists in the hall below, brandishing their assegais, prepared to murder him. There was, as a matter of fact, another version of the scene which had Gordon on the landing blazing away with a revolver at the advancing savages, but it was the image of martyred British innocence that most people preferred. I shall pause here as there's a section break. I find this a fascinating painting, The Death of General Gordon, and it's not much of a recommended rabbit hole since it's a simple Google image, but you can find it. And it was so iconic that Sherlock Holmes, in the official canon, has a reproduction of this painting on his wall. It was indeed everywhere, and it was a great surprise to me. These days, as I say, the Empire isn't very, certainly not fashionable, but also not just isn't covered. So it's not in some great London museum. It's actually at a free museum in Leeds, and I was very surprised to walk in and see the original right there. It's something that I've looked at quite a bit. It's iconic and was all over the place in Victorian literature and popular art, and there it is. So that was from, I say, I've got a very old edition, so it's James Morris, Pax Britannica, The Climax of an Empire, which is really to do with art. So we had Lawrence James, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, facts. Then we have Niall Ferguson, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, analysis. Pax Britannica, really focusing on art. Number 4, The Great Game, actually the most recent that I've read, by Peter Hopkirk. This is the struggle for empire in Central Asia. So Britain in the 19th century governs India, and the empire is expanding out into Central Asia, and of course the Russian Empire is expanding out, but you have essentially Afghanistan, many other Central Asian states in the middle. The Great Game is not straightforward warfare. A great deal is to do with alliances and trading and intelligence. This is something that's covered in the Rudyard Kipling book, Kim, but Peter Hopkirk really sets out in immense detail. This is another few hundred page, 600 pages. It's another immense volume. I must say, unlike The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, this is not so commuter friendly. This is one that you need to set time aside for, sit down, you'll get out of it what you put into it. This is one to study. But I have gotten out of this a great deal, and I really do recommend it as my 4th favourite. Now, in Kim, this intelligence game is referred to as the Great Game. And much like the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. Chapter 10 of Peter Hopkirk's book is called The Great Game. On January the 14th, 1831, a bearded and dishevelled figure in native dress arrived out of the desert at the remote village of Tibby on India's northwest frontier. The village has long since vanished from the map, but at the time it served as a border post between British India and the group of small, independent states lying to the west, then collectively known as Sind. It was with relief that the stranger had reached the safety of company territory, and the reassuring sight of the Indian Army sepoys manning the frontier. He had been travelling for more than a year, often exposed to great danger, and at times doubting whether he would return alive. For beneath his darkened complexion, burned almost black by months in the sun, his features were clearly those of a European. He was, in fact, a British officer in disguise, Lieutenant Arthur Connolly, of the 6th Bengal Native Light Cavalry, and the first of Lord Ellenborough's young bloods to be sent into the field to reconnoitre the military and political no-man's land between the Caucasus and the Khyber, through which a Russian army might march. Daring, resourceful, and ambitious, Connolly was the archetypal great game player, and it was he, fittingly enough, who first coined this memorable phrase in a letter to a friend. He had an astonishing tale to tell, as well as a wealth of advice for those who were to follow him into the wild and lawless regions of Central Asia. It was on all these matters that Lieutenant Connolly, not yet 24, now reported to his superiors. Despite his junior rank and tender years, his views were to carry much weight and to have considerable influence on his chiefs in those early years of Anglo-Russian rivalry in Asia. I feel that's a strong enough place to leave it. As I say, this is The Great Game by Peter Hopkirk, my 4th favourite book on the British Empire. A very hefty tome. You perhaps heard the thump as I put it down. But again, one that I found very, very rewarding. And I think the mindset of those playing the great game gives an insight into, well, how the empire was built more widely, beyond those confines. Okay, my top 5. I shall get to number 5. Empire of the Seas, How the Navy Forged the Modern World. A BBC book by Brian Lavery, but it's also designed to accompany a TV show which was presented by Dan Snow, who's a very, very, very good presenter. This is a hard focus on the Navy. All 4 of the previous books rarely focused on the land, but of course the British Empire was very much an empire that ruled the waves, and this one book I think does the best overview of the Royal Navy from the days of Francis Drake until, well, Churchill. It is, the version I've got is the hardback, and it's beautifully illustrated, full cover, and it admits, the Royal Navy of today is much, much smaller, although it has the ability to destroy most of the world's great cities, and it no longer enjoys the enormous public respect it once did, but is still powerful, infinitely flexible, with ships, aircraft and marines able to operate on, under and above the sea, as well as on land. Of course, in the British Armed Forces, the Marines are part of the Royal Navy. It is a fascinating documentary, and as I say, you can see the TV show or flick through the coffee table book, and this is a hugely enjoyable book that simply goes into, well, as the subtitle says, how the Royal Navy forged the modern world. These are my top 5 factual books on the British Empire. Of course, there are great novels. I find it interesting, those with a more literary bent tend to gravitate to A Passage to India, which I must admit was not necessarily my favourite. The 7 Pillars of Wisdom gives, the first-hand account of Lawrence of Arabia, so if you've seen the film of that name, then this gives, the real account. For me, Kipling's writing is probably the best, always unfashionable, in the same way that Ian Fleming is. I would suggest Kim would be a great book. Of course, he was, largely educated and born in India and worked there as an adult, and his stories, well, some would say he was an apologist for empire. I've heard that. I don't think he really was. Some people say as a proponent of empire. I think he just told it as he saw it. I think he was an immense observer of society, and of course he wrote the original Jungle Book. These books were much loved, I believe, by my great-grandfather. My family at the time collected them, certainly in the 20s, because those are the editions I have. I've got Plain Tales from the Hills here, and I think these short stories are fascinating. They give an insight not just to British society, but also to Indian society at the time. There's also an out-of-print book I have called An Indian Day, which I believe was my great-grandmother's favourite book. And again, it's about life in the Raj. It's not talking about rights, wrongs, or particular events. It's just an insight, a window into day-to-day life. So I really enjoy these novels. They say fiction never lies, and I think they give a good insight into, well, what it was actually like to be there. These 5 books are my absolute favourite, and I recommend them to anyone. But if you've read books on the British Empire and you have something to recommend to me, well, you can email me at albionneverdies@gmail.com. You can message me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies, because I'm always on the lookout for more. I hope you enjoy this podcast, and if you read them, I hope you enjoy these books. Goodbye.